I spent 11 years building a department everyone depended on. Then, in a meeting that lasted less than 5 minutes, my promotion was handed to the executive's entitled son, and what happened after I quietly walked out shattered far more than anyone in that room could have imagined. The meeting lasted less than 5 minutes. I remember that because I had spent 11 years preparing for it. The conference room was unusually quiet. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, making the polished table gleam as if the company wanted this moment to look perfect. Around me sat executives in tailored suits, HR representatives pretending to smile, and department managers who refused to meet my eyes. Our CEO stood at the head of the table with the confidence of someone who believed every decision he made would be applauded. "I'd like to congratulate our new director," he announced, "someone who represents the future of this company." For one impossible second, I thought he was talking about me. Then he smiled toward the other side of the room. "My son, Daniel." The applause sounded hesitant, like rain hitting a roof before a storm truly begins. Daniel stood, buttoned his expensive jacket, and accepted congratulations he had done absolutely nothing to earn. He shook hands with executives who had spent months asking me to prepare budgets, solve crises, and lead strategy meetings. One even congratulated him for his vision. Vision. He had been in the company for less than 6 months. I had spent 11 years building the department they were celebrating. No one looked at me. Not because they didn't know what had happened, because they did. My stomach didn't twist. My heart didn't race. The strange part was how calm everything suddenly became, as if disappointment had frozen time itself. The room blurred into a collection of voices that no longer belonged to me. Daniel finally walked over, wearing the confident smile of someone who had never questioned whether the world would make space for him. "I hope we can work closely together," he said, extending his hand. I looked at it for a second. Then I shook it. "Congratulations." Nothing more. Nothing less. His smile grew wider, perhaps expecting anger, perhaps hoping for a scene. Instead, he received the one thing people like him rarely know how to handle: silence. That silence followed me as I walked back to my office. The hallway felt longer than usual. Employees glanced up from their desks, trying to read my face before anyone had officially announced the decision. News always traveled faster than email in corporate buildings. Emily from HR appeared near the elevators. She didn't say a word. She simply looked at me with the expression people reserve for funerals. That was all the confirmation I needed. Inside my office, everything looked exactly the same. Family photos, the whiteboard covered in project timelines, a shelf filled with awards carrying my name but somehow feeling completely meaningless now. 11 years condensed into decorations. I closed the door and leaned against it, finally allowing myself one slow breath. People often imagine betrayal as something loud. It isn't. Sometimes betrayal is hearing applause through a conference room wall while realizing every late night, every sacrificed weekend, every impossible deadline you conquered had already been erased by someone else's last name. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. "Come in." It was Marcus, one of my senior analysts. He stepped inside carefully. "Is it true?" I nodded. "They gave it to Daniel." Marcus stared at the floor. "They can't be serious." "They are." Another silence settled between us, different from the one in the boardroom. This one carried disappointment instead of arrogance. "They've made a mistake," he finally whispered. I almost smiled. "No. They have. They made a decision. Those are not always the same thing." Marcus left without another word. Within minutes, messages began appearing on my phone. "Are you okay? Please tell me this isn't true. What happened?" I answered none of them. Instead, I looked through the glass wall separating my office from the department. More than 60 people worked there. Some had joined straight out of college. Some had followed me from other companies years earlier because they believed we were building something different. Together, we had transformed one of the weakest divisions in the company into its strongest. Client satisfaction reached record levels. Turnover became almost non-existent. Deadlines that once caused panic eventually became routine because everyone trusted one another. We weren't the loudest department. We were simply the one everyone depended on. And that hadn't happened because of executive speeches. It happened because ordinary people chose each other every single day. Looking at them, memories began surfacing one after another. The overnight product launch where half the team slept under their desks. The winter storm when everyone brought blankets and worked through a power outage together. The young intern who arrived terrified and 3 years later became one of our strongest project managers. Those moments couldn't be measured on quarterly reports, but they were the real foundation of everything we'd built. Ironically, Daniel had never seen any of it. When he arrived 6 months earlier as part of the company's so-called leadership development program, everyone immediately knew why. He wasn't there to learn. He was there because he already belonged to the executive family. Still, I gave him every opportunity. I explained our systems, invited him into planning meetings, protected him when he confused client retention with acquisition during a board presentation, corrected reports before executives noticed mistakes. I believed experience could be taught. Character had to come from somewhere else. Slowly, small things began changing. Ideas I introduced during strategy sessions somehow appeared later in Daniel's presentations. Projects my team spent weeks preparing suddenly carried his signature. Executives who had barely visited our floor started praising him for improvements they had never bothered to understand. At first, I blamed coincidence, then politics. Eventually, I stopped looking for explanations altogether. Because deep down, I already knew the answer. I just wasn't ready to admit it. Standing in my office that afternoon, watching my team pretend to work while secretly watching me through computer screens, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry because I'd lost a title. I was angry because 11 years of loyalty had been treated like a recommendation instead of a qualification. And if leadership could do that to me, what would stop them from doing it to everyone else? That question lingered in the air long after the applause upstairs had faded. If you think losing the promotion was the real betrayal, you're about to discover that it was only the beginning. I didn't cry, not in my office, not in the parking garage, not during the drive home. Some disappointments run too deep for tears. They settle inside your chest like cold iron, making every breath a little heavier than the last. By the following morning, the announcement had spread through the company. My inbox was overflowing with messages from coworkers, former colleagues, and even managers from departments I barely interacted with. Some simply wrote, "I'm sorry." Others admitted what no executive ever would. Everyone believed the promotion had been mine long before the meeting ever took place. One message stood out above the rest. "If you decide to leave, call me first." I read it twice before closing my laptop, wondering if everyone else had noticed the cracks in leadership long before I had. The atmosphere inside the office had completely changed overnight. Conversations stopped whenever I walked past, not because people wanted to avoid me, but because they didn't know how to pretend everything was normal. The usual laughter near the coffee station had vanished. Even the reception desk, normally filled with cheerful greetings, felt strangely quiet. I greeted everyone exactly as I always had, asking about families, projects, and weekend plans, trying to preserve at least one familiar routine. They smiled politely, but disappointment lingered behind every expression. I realized they weren't feeling sorry for me anymore. They were questioning whether loyalty and hard work actually meant anything in this company. At 10 o'clock, Daniel held his first leadership meeting as the department's new director. The invitation arrived with the ambitious subject line, "A new era begins." He took Linda's former seat at the head of the conference table and opened with a confident smile. "This department has become too comfortable," he declared. The statement was almost surreal. We had exceeded every performance target for 3 consecutive years, held the highest client satisfaction scores in company history, and maintained the lowest employee turnover in the company. Yet Daniel insisted the department needed to be shaken up. He announced mandatory restructuring, daily performance reviews, new approval chains, and executive oversight for decisions that previously took minutes. Every proposal sounded impressive until you understood how much unnecessary bureaucracy it would create. When he finished, I asked a single question. "What problem are we solving?" The room fell silent. Daniel smiled as though he had expected resistance. "We're creating accountability," he replied. I kept my voice calm. "We already have accountability. The current system is producing record results." His answer wasn't really an answer. Sometimes numbers don't tell the whole story. A few managers lowered their heads to hide faint smiles, but nobody spoke. Everyone understood that facts had lost to family connections long before this meeting had begun. The real surprise came later that afternoon. Marcus knocked on my office door, but he wasn't alone. Sarah walked in behind him, followed by Mike, Priya, and several others. Within moments, 8 members of my leadership team stood inside my office with the door quietly closed behind them. Nobody rushed to speak. Finally, Sarah looked directly at me and asked, "Are you leaving?" I admitted I hadn't made a decision. Marcus exchanged a glance with everyone else before answering for the group. "We have. If you leave, we leave." I immediately told them not to make emotional decisions because of me. Marcus shook his head. "This isn't emotional." Sarah reminded me how I had fought for raises when budgets were frozen. Mike recalled the nights I stayed until midnight, helping people fix mistakes instead of blaming them. Priya quietly added that I had built a department where people weren't afraid to admit they needed help. Then Marcus said the sentence none of us would forget. "They didn't just pass over you. They showed every employee in this company exactly what loyalty is worth." No one raised their voice. No dramatic speeches followed. Their certainty was far more powerful than anger. And for the first time, I realized this was no longer just my story. Less than an hour later, Emily from HR knocked on my door again. She closed it behind her without saying a word and sat across from my desk. "I wanted you to hear this from me before the rumors start," she said quietly. My stomach tightened. She explained that HR had already received multiple resignation inquiries that morning. "How many?" I asked. Emily hesitated before answering. "I stopped counting after 12. The number echoed in my mind. 12 people weren't threatening to leave. They were already asking how. At that moment, I realized the executives believed they had secured the company's future by promoting Daniel. In reality, they had just triggered the first stage of a collapse they couldn't yet see. If 12 resignation inquiries arrived within 24 hours, imagine what would happen once the board discovered why the company's best people were suddenly preparing to walk away. If this story made you wonder what you would do in the same situation, let me know in the comments. Would you have stayed and fought, or walked away with your self-respect? And if you enjoy stories about workplace betrayal, quiet justice, and unexpected consequences, don't forget to subscribe. There's much more ahead. Monday morning arrived with an uncomfortable kind of silence. Not the peaceful silence of focused employees beginning another productive week, but the uneasy quiet that settles over a building when everyone senses something is wrong, yet nobody knows how serious it really is. The elevators were full, computers powered on, meetings filled the calendars, and people smiled when they passed one another. On the surface, everything looked exactly as it always had. Underneath, the atmosphere felt as fragile as glass, waiting for the first crack. I had spent the entire weekend thinking about what Marcus and the others had told me. Their loyalty humbled me, but it also frightened me. I never wanted anyone to sacrifice their career because of mine. 11 years earlier, I had joined this company believing good leadership meant helping people build stable futures. The last thing I wanted was to become the reason they abandoned those futures. That resolve lasted until my first meeting with Daniel. He had scheduled a department-wide strategy session to introduce what he proudly called his 100-day transformation plan. Colorful slides filled the screen behind him. There were charts, slogans, new reporting structures, and ambitious promises about innovation. It looked polished. It sounded impressive. The problem was that every proposal ignored how our department actually operated. He announced that account managers would rotate clients every month to encourage fresh thinking. The room stiffened. Our strongest client relationships had taken years to build. Trust wasn't something you could transfer with a spreadsheet. Next came mandatory executive approval for discounts and service exceptions that team leaders had previously handled in minutes. Daniel called it stronger oversight. Everyone else immediately recognized it as another bottleneck that would slow decisions and frustrate customers. I finally raised my hand. Have you spoken with any of our clients before making these changes? Daniel smiled politely. I don't think we should let old habits limit new ideas. That's not what I asked. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Around the table, managers lowered their eyes, pretending to take notes while quietly waiting to see what would happen. I've reviewed the reports, Daniel answered. Reports don't tell you why people stay. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument. Daniel quickly moved to the next slide without responding. By lunchtime, the consequences had already begun. One of our oldest clients called me directly instead of contacting their account manager. I heard we're getting assigned to someone new, he said. Is that true? I chose my words carefully. Nothing has happened yet. If it does, he replied, we'll have to reconsider our contract. It was the first warning. It wouldn't be the last. Throughout the afternoon, similar conversations unfolded across the department. Employees weren't complaining. They were quietly trying to reassure anxious clients while following instructions they didn't believe in themselves. Every hallway conversation ended the same way, with uncertain expressions and unfinished sentences. Near the end of the day, Emily appeared outside my office once again. You have a minute? I nodded. She closed the door behind her and placed a folder on my desk. I probably shouldn't be showing you this. Inside were copies of exit interview request forms. Some were incomplete, others had already been signed. I recognized every name: Marcus, Sarah, Mike, Priya, Ben. Then more names followed. None of them had officially resigned yet. They had simply requested the paperwork. I looked up slowly. They're serious. Emily nodded. Completely. I leaned back in my chair, unable to find the right words. I told them not to do this. I know. They won't listen. Emily offered a tired smile. No, they won't. She hesitated before speaking again. There's something else. What is it? The executive team still doesn't know. I frowned. What do you mean? They think people are just upset about the promotion. They expect everything to settle down in a few days. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it showed how disconnected leadership had become from the people keeping the company alive. They have no idea what's coming, Emily whispered. Neither did I. That evening, as most of the building emptied, I stayed behind to finish a few reports. Old habits are difficult to break. Through the glass walls, I watched employees gather in small groups near the elevators. They weren't gossiping. They were talking quietly, checking on one another, making sure nobody felt alone. For the first time since the promotion, I realized something important. The department had never stayed together because of company policies. It had stayed together because people trusted each other. Trust couldn't be ordered from the executive floor. It couldn't be inherited through a family name. And once it was broken, no presentation in the world could put it back together. As I packed my bag to leave, my phone buzzed with a notification. It wasn't from anyone on my team. It was from a member of the company's board requesting a private meeting the following morning. No explanation, no agenda, just 4 words. We need to talk. The board meeting wasn't on anyone's calendar. At 9 o'clock the next morning, my phone rang. Claire, this is Robert Hayes from the board of directors. We'd appreciate it if you could join us upstairs. There was no explanation, no small talk, just an invitation that sounded more like an order. The atmosphere inside the boardroom was nothing like the executive meetings I'd attended over the years. Thick folders covered the table. HR was there. Legal was there. Even the CFO looked unusually tense. Daniel sat confidently near the end of the table, but I noticed his expression change the moment I walked in. Robert motioned toward the empty chair beside him. Please, have a seat. Once the door closed, he got straight to the point. We've received reports that a significant number of employees are preparing to resign. Before we make any assumptions, we'd like to hear your perspective. I learned about the resignation inquiries yesterday, I answered honestly. Robert nodded. Did you encourage anyone to leave? No. Did you ask anyone to protest the promotion? No. Have you discussed resigning with your team? I shook my head. I told them not to make emotional decisions. Before Robert could continue, Daniel leaned forward. With all due respect, that's difficult to believe. Claire has enormous influence over the department. Whether she said the words directly or not, her disappointment clearly encouraged this behavior. I looked at him for the first time since entering the room. My disappointment didn't cause this. He immediately disagreed. It absolutely did. Without raising my voice, I opened my notebook and slid several reports across the table. No, your decision did. The board members quietly reviewed the documents. 3 years of performance metrics, record client retention, the lowest employee turnover in the company, growth that consistently exceeded every forecast. Every page proved the same thing. The department had become successful because people trusted its leadership. Nobody is leaving because I didn't become director, I said calmly. They're leaving because they no longer believe performance matters. The room fell silent. Even Daniel had nothing to say. Emily from HR finally spoke. She opened another folder and looked directly at the board. As of this morning, we have 19 formal resignation inquiries from Claire's department. One board member looked up in disbelief. 19? Emily nodded. And that's only the employees who contacted HR. Several others have already requested employment verification letters. The CFO slowly removed his glasses. If they leave together, Emily finished the sentence for him. They take more than 60% of our client relationships with them. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I think everyone is overreacting. They're emotional. Give it a week. Before anyone could respond, the boardroom door opened. The secretary stepped inside carrying another folder. I'm sorry to interrupt, but 3 more resignation notices just arrived. She placed the documents on the table and quietly walked out. No one touched them. 22. The number alone changed the atmosphere in the room. Robert looked at me again. Claire, if we asked you to speak with your team, would they stay? I answered without hesitation. I won't manipulate them. My help has never been the problem. Another silence settled over the room before one of the oldest board members finally spoke. I believe we've been asking the wrong questions. Everyone turned toward him. He slowly closed the performance report in front of him. The issue isn't why employees are leaving. The issue is why they no longer trust the people leading this company. No one argued. Robert looked around the table, then made his decision. I want an emergency executive session immediately. His eyes stopped on Daniel. This meeting will continue without the executive leadership team. For the first time since receiving his promotion, Daniel looked genuinely nervous. As security quietly opened the boardroom door, I realized the investigation had changed direction. The board was no longer questioning the employees. They were questioning the executives who had created this crisis. The emergency board meeting lasted nearly 4 hours. No one from the executive team was allowed back into the room until it was over. I waited downstairs in my office, answering emails that suddenly felt unimportant. Every few minutes, someone from my team stopped by, pretending to ask about work while really checking whether I was all right. Their concern reminded me that whatever happened next, I wasn't facing it alone. Shortly after 3 o'clock, Robert called again. "Claire, could you come upstairs?" The boardroom looked different this time. The tension had disappeared, replaced by quiet determination. Daniel wasn't there, neither was his father. Only the board members, HR, and legal remained. Robert folded his hands. "We've completed our initial review. The promotion process violated several internal governance policies. Required interviews were skipped, performance evaluations were ignored, and proper approval procedures were bypassed." No one sounded angry. They sounded disappointed. "The board has unanimously voted to suspend Daniel's appointment while an independent review is completed," Robert continued. "Effective immediately, he will no longer oversee your department." I simply nodded. For some reason, the news didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a correction. Another board member slid a document toward me. "We would also like to offer you the position of department director." Months earlier, those words would have meant everything. Now they meant surprisingly little. I looked around the room before answering. "I appreciate your confidence, but I'm going to decline." Several people exchanged surprised glances. Robert frowned slightly. "May I ask why?" "Because the title was never the real issue." I took a slow breath. My team believed this company rewarded integrity, experience, and hard work. Last week they learned that wasn't true. Even if you reverse the decision today, you can't simply ask people to forget what happened. The room remained silent. "I gave this company 11 years, I continued. "I don't regret a single one of them. But trust is like glass. Once it's broken, you can repair it, yet the cracks never completely disappear." No one tried to change my mind. I stood, thanked the board for correcting their mistake, and quietly walked out of the room. By the time I reached my office, my team was already waiting. Marcus looked at my face and immediately asked, "Well?" "They offered me the promotion." For a brief second, everyone smiled. Then Sarah noticed my expression. "You said no." I did. No one questioned the decision. Instead, Marcus laughed softly. "I had a feeling." Emily walked in a few moments later carrying a small envelope. "A recruiting firm dropped this off yesterday," she said. "I thought you should open it after the meeting." Inside was an offer from one of the company's largest competitors. They weren't just offering me a leadership position, they wanted me to build an entirely new division from the ground up. For the first time in days, I smiled without forcing it. Over the next month, I accepted the offer. Several members of my team applied on their own. I never asked anyone to follow me, and I never recommended that they leave. Each person made their own decision. Some stayed because they believed the company deserved another chance. Others accepted new opportunities elsewhere. Those who eventually joined me did so because they wanted to keep working with people they trusted. 6 months later, I heard what had become of my former employer. The independent review confirmed that the promotion process had been manipulated. New governance rules were introduced. Executive hiring procedures were rewritten. HR received greater authority to challenge leadership decisions, and the board created independent oversight for future executive appointments. The company survived, but it was forced to learn an expensive lesson. As for Daniel, he returned after the investigation, not as a director, but in an entry-level leadership development role with no direct reports. For the first time in his career, he had to earn respect instead of inheriting it. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd accepted that promotion. Maybe I would still be sitting in the same office, trying to repair a culture that no longer believed in itself. Instead, every morning I walk into a new building where titles matter less than character, where ideas are judged before surnames, and where the people around me chose to be there, not because they had to, but because they believed in one another. Looking back, I realized something I couldn't see on the day I lost that promotion. They thought they had taken away my future. In reality, they gave me the courage to find a better one.